September 1st, 7:03 p.m. Please go ahead and leave a rating and a review on whatever app it is that you might be listening on. Helps me a bunch. Follow me on any social media platforms at Jexplex, Jexplex. And yes, of course, the title is exactly what it says. It's going to be this guy talking about his father who killed numerous people. Definitely one of the crazier calls I've had. So yeah, go ahead and enjoy.
Yo, Jexplex, answer the fucking phone, dude.
Hello.
Jax.
All right, so it's to my understanding that your father is a serial killer. How I kind of want to start this off in the broadest sense possible too, because it's quite easy to read about these things and not realize the emotional impact that it's going to have on the people around that person. Oftentimes I could find shame in my siblings doing things that I would consider to be quite petty or a little bit annoying. Maybe they don't hold the door open for somebody else or whatever, and those are minute annoyances. But when it comes to something as grave as that, I find that the emotional impact of it can be quite deep, and I don't think that people often want to think about someone that they know doing something like that. And I kind of want you to go into how that makes you feel.
Okay, so I didn't know what happened until I was already an adult. So I think, that's it. Probably would have been worse had I been an edgy teenager and finding out that my dad was a serial killer. And honestly, I probably would have bragged about it if I was a teenager. Like, that's the kind of teenager I was. I was just edgy. I was rebellious. I was getting in trouble a lot, and it would have been a bragging point. As an adult, it's not. I would say it's not like the thing that concerns me as an adult is that he's schizophrenic. What concerns me is me passing that to my kids. That's the main concern.
Do you have any siblings?
I do. They're not his, though. I have half brothers.
So this is a uniquely kind of a you thing.
This is just me, yep.
And so how did you come about to realize that he was a serial killer in the first place?
I'll try to TLDR the story, but basically I moved out of my mom's when I was 19, and when I changed my address, when I changed my mailing address, I started getting letters from a man in prison. Like, I was just getting letters from a man in prison. I didn't know who this man was. I had always been raised to believe that someone else was my father. This guy was sending me letters saying that he's my dad, telling me, he wants to have a relationship with me, and some of the letters were coherent, some of them weren't. And what I take it as is, when he was on his medication and when he wasn't on his medication. I confronted my mother about it because in the letters, he knew too much about me to the point that it couldn't just be a random coincidence. He knew too much about me. So I confronted my mother about it, and she didn't deny anything. She said that the man that was sending me letters was best friends with the man who I was told was my dad growing up.
I'm sure this probably spurred a bunch of discussions between you and your mother. And how did she feel about the nature of the crimes that he committed?
She thinks he is an insane person. She thinks that she dodged a bullet with him. She thinks that my own perspective on it is that she feels like she was doing me a favor by not even introducing him into my life, using the other man as my father figure, and like I said, keeping him as squeaky clean out of my life as possible. I'm sure I have other family members that did know, and they also were in on it and kept it a secret from me. There also is a pretty big sense of shame. She is ashamed of what she did.
She's ashamed that she kept it from you?
No, she's ashamed that she had a child with him.
Damn, I feel like there's so much to pick apart here. So right now we've already established, I feel like I have a good picture that, I can kind of see your perspective. I can kind of see your mom's perspective. I kind of want to get into also this father figure of yours that you had growing up. How do you feel about him?
This is a tough one because he also wasn't that great of a guy, but still an upgrade from serial killer. But I mean, he was I don't have much of a relationship with him either. Basically, from the pieces of the puzzle that I put together as an adult, like I said, this is all me learning in hindsight. But my mother cheated on him with his best friend, and that was the reason why they broke up. So me being born and coming out looking like the serial killer guy is the reason why they no longer had a relationship. I always felt like growing up around him that he didn't want me around. I always got the sense that I was second favorite to my brother, which is biologically his.
And I'm assuming that he felt that way not only because you weren't biologically his, but of course because of who your father was.
Yes, there's like a little bit of spite. As a kid, you don't realize. You're like, why doesn't my dad want to hang out with me? Why doesn't my dad want to play basketball with me? Why doesn't my dad want to play Mega Man with me? You know, stuff like that. As an adult, you look at it and you're like, oh, okay, this kind of is making sense.
Yeah, I feel like I'm actually currently in that phase of my life too, coming up on being in my early 20s, making a lot of realizations on things that you might have not picked up in your youth. And it's part of it amazes me because I can actually see how much my brain has physically matured from point A to point B to be able to pick up on these things. And part of it also saddens me because, you know, in your youth, you would have wished that you had known these things. And
exactly. Like, you don't put two and two together as a kid. You don't realize, you know, what A does and the consequences of like where it ends up at, because you're just a kid and you just want attention. You just want, this is my dad, I want to hang out with my dad.
And in that same vein of kind of being young, do you hold resentment towards them for keeping this a secret from you, or do you think
I did initially. Like I said, I did when I was 19. I definitely was very resentful. I was pissed. Like, I'm not even gonna lie, I was pissed. I took out a lot of anger on her at the time. I'm in my 30s now, so I can see why she did it. And if I were being completely honest with myself, you know, I probably would have done the same. Like, that's just being honest.
And so I feel like we've established a pretty good rapport about the people that might have had the closest to do with the situation. Now I kind of want to ask about the nature of the crimes that your father committed. Do you know how many people he murdered?
From my understanding, it was 2.
Do you have any understanding as to why he did that? Was it because of the schizophrenia?
Yes, it was a schizophrenic episode. He was. This is the explanation that I got from my mom. He was chasing after a woman, and this woman. I'm not sure if he did or did not sleep with this woman. I'm not sure. I'm not 100% on this. I think he did, though. It is what it sounds like. But she was not interested in continuing the relationship with him. And he believed in his own schizophrenic delusion that this woman was being kept from him by the government, by neo-Nazis, by Illuminati, by, you know what I mean? Like, he thought that there was some sort of higher power preventing him from getting to this woman. And essentially what happened was he raided the building that she was at with a machine gun, and he killed a few people. From what I understand, 2, possibly 3. I'm not exactly sure of the number, but I believe it's 2, possibly 3 people before he ended up in a shootout with police and surrendered.
Did you ever get to ask him about his own interpretation as to why he did what he did?
I have not.
Is this something that you dread doing?
The only reason I don't want to ask him is because I don't think that I'll get a straight answer from him.
We're going to dive a little bit more because I feel like there's a lot to dissect about his personality too, because at least in my interpretations about serial killers, I often find that some of them are perfectly sane and they commit the acts because they feel like they just want to do it. And there are others who are severely delusioned and needed help and never got it, and it was ultimately a failure on multiple people's part alongside their parts. But ultimately, they commit these acts. And it seems as though your father seems to be more so on the side of he seemed to be under a sort of delusion, and he wasn't able to get some sort of help that he might have needed to stop him from doing these acts. So it seems as though he's a little bit more on the gray side.
Yes. At like looking at it as, like I said, in 2022 as an adult, looking at it now, I think if he had a trial today, he very possibly would be in a psych ward. I believe he would be in a psych ward. He wouldn't be in a prison. He would be treated as a more of a victim of the system itself than a criminal. Obviously, he did do horrific things, but he was failed by society in a way.
His intent was to kill this particular woman, yes?
No. He did not want to kill the woman. He wanted to, I believe, kidnap the woman and take her away, something like that. He didn't want to kill her. He killed the people that he believed were preventing him from getting to the woman.
And the motivation for this was, as you had mentioned before, the delusions. And then you're also not sure if he had slept with this woman. So there was probably some sort of emotional connection?
Yeah. From what I believe, he did sleep with her, and then she did not want to continue the relationship. Or maybe they did have some sort of a short relationship, and she didn't want to continue the relationship. From my understanding, also, she did have a restraining order against him, as well as my mother told me she also had a restraining order against him. She knew he was off.
And at this point, were your mother and father married or dating?
No, they were not. They never got married, but they were dating.
So at one point they were dating, and when he committed murder to these people, were you born at this point?
I was already born, yes. I must have been 5 or 6.
So it seems as though she kept it pretty well hidden from you.
Oh, yeah, I completely oblivious. The only time, I met the guy one time in person before he committed the crimes and went to prison. And this is probably a little bit grim, but, and I don't actually know if this ties into when he was planning on committing the crime. The only time, and it was about that age, I was around 5 or 6, he came to my mother's house, decked out in full army fatigues. He was showing me all of his military weapons, grenades, and all the stuff that he had, and like doing the whole macho, oh, look at all this stuff, it's cool, look at all these guns, and like kind of like that. Even as a kid, it was off. Like even as a 5-6-year-old kid, I was like, why is this guy showing me his guns with this guy that I don't know? And I remember being off, and my mom explained it to me as, he's a friend of your dad's. That's it. That's all she told me. And the guy was gone, and I don't know if that's when he wanted to say bye to me before he planned on doing this stuff. I don't know if that's what it was, but yeah, that's all I remember of him in person.
And so
he was speaking with my mother.
Because I was wondering, because I was like, how did he even find your house? So there must have been, as you said, there was a form of communication between your mom and your dad. Do you know the nature of that relationship? Like, was she telling him to go away, stay away, and then he just showed up?
I don't know. I don't know if she was telling him to stay away. I do think that she was trying to limit my exposure to him, but she also felt bad because obviously he's my dad and he should be able to see me. But yeah, she did want to limit my exposure to him. And also, another maybe thing that I left out is that he was communicating with my mother via letters while in prison as well. Before I got the original letter when I was 19, he was also communicating with my mom as well. She's one of the only people that still writes to him. Do
you know the nature of their current relationship?
It's just writing letters, and I think just speaking about me. I don't think that they have anything. There's nothing relationship-wise besides that.
No, nothing really. I mean, I highly doubt anything emotional at that point.
It doesn't seem like there's anything emotional at all, or even platonic. It's just
keeping it professional, almost, and just discussing.
Keeping it like, this is, I'm doing this because it's your son, and that's the only reason why.
Do you know how he felt about your mother eventually getting together with his best friend? Was he upset about that?
So from what I take is, this is, like I said, this is me putting the puzzle pieces together. My mom would never admit to something like this. Like I said, she's very ashamed of it. My mother slept with my biological father in a maybe possible argument with the man who I was told was my father. They were in a relationship for a long time, a very rocky relationship, a very emotional relationship. I do know now as an adult later that there was a little bit of domestic violence in the relationship. In a spat between them, in an off period, she had slept with his best friend, which is my bio father, and conceived me, and then got back together with him. got back together with who I was told was my father.
So there seems to be quite a bit of resentment, I feel like, between the father figure that you have, and I feel like he has a lot of resentment towards you for that.
Yes. Like I said, I didn't pick up on it as a kid. All I picked up on was, it was like I was not the favorite kid, because he's still my brother. He still wanted to hang out with my brother and do stuff with my brother, and my brother was the golden child all the time, and that's just how it was.
You didn't really pick up on it as a kid, but now looking back, were there any moments that stuck out to you that, or your father figure was just not fucking with you?
Yeah, there was one. I remember being like 12. I might have been like 12-ish years old, and I was big into basketball when I was younger. And I just remember I had made like 10 free throws in a row. I was like, Dad, I can't miss. What? Like, look at me. Watch me do this. And he was just so disinterested. I was really bummed about it. I didn't put two and two together. I didn't even imagine that he could. That's not even something that's on my head, that he possibly isn't my father.
So what's the nature of your current relationship with your biological father as it stands?
After I confronted my mother and got all the information out of her that she was willing to give me, I did write letters back and forth with my dad for a while. I would say probably about 5 years. So until I was like 24-ish. I stopped speaking with him after a while because I was talking with him about the women that I was dating and how my life was going, and he was very adamant about telling me to avoid women. He was very much like, women will ruin your life. Like, that was kind of how that was his perspective on it. I mean, even though he was the one who committed the crimes, it was still the women that ruined his life, which is an absolute, it's a mindfuck to me, taking zero responsibility. I think as well, obviously, was very interested in this was my future wife that we were talking about. So I'm married to the woman that I was talking about with him when I was 24, and he was telling me to avoid, don't move in with her, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't give her any money, don't, just everything, don't support her, don't. And I eventually, I was getting frustrated with him, and there was a point where he said, if you're going to treat me like this, then I'm just going to ask you for money, because if you're just giving out money willy-nilly, then kind of like that was his attitude. And I stopped. I wrote him a pretty scathing letter, and then I stopped talking with him. I stopped writing him letters. It's been a while since I've wrote him last. I wrote him when my son was born, and he did not write me back. Did
you ever see him in person?
I did not.
Do you ever think about seeing him in person, even now?
I have. I've considered. I considered once I found out who he was. I considered driving to this maximum security prison where he's at and just saying hi. But I don't know. I don't know why I didn't.
I want to get back to him in a second, but have you told your son about your past?
No, my son's 3.
Oh.
My son's 3. He's due. Yeah.
How do you plan on handling that as a parent?
I don't want to lie to him. I'm obviously going to leave out some details, but I'm not going to lie to him. I want to be as honest with him as possible. There's going to be a point where he's going to say, where's your dad? Where's your dad at? And I'm going to tell him who my dad is. I think I'm just going to sugarcoat it a little bit. I'll say, my dad is a bad man. He's in prison right now.
Do you ever think that you might even show him this episode when the time is right?
Yeah, I definitely could. Yeah. I would like him to hear my adult unabridged opinion when he's ready.
When that time comes, and I hope it does, is there anything that you'd like to say to future him in this particular moment?
That's a tough question.
We can come back to that one. I feel like that's something they have to sit on for a little bit.
That's a tough question. Yeah, let's come back to that one.
Once again, I want to go back to your father for a little bit. So, do you know anything about your grandparents?
A little bit. I know a little bit of my bio father's parents. So when I found out that he was my father, his father, my father's father, was still alive and wanted to get a hold of me. He wanted to see me. He was actually on his deathbed, and I don't know if it was. I don't want to blame my mom, but I don't know if it was my mom gaslighting me, telling me that he possibly wasn't mine. We didn't do any DNA testing or anything like that. I got the letters from him, and I asked her, did she sleep with him, and she didn't deny it. so he possibly could be my father. And it wasn't official. It wasn't official until I did a 23andMe DNA test and matched with all of his relatives. And so I wasn't sure if this grandfather was my grandfather. And I was, like I said, I was hesitant on meeting him. He was on his deathbed. I felt like it was a little bit strange. It is a regret of mine that I didn't meet him before he died, but it's just kind of how the cards unfolded.
Do you have any idea as to how your biological father was raised?
Not really. I know, like, the extent of what I know about him in his civilian days, I guess. I know he dropped out of high school. He was a burnout. That's what they called it in the 80s. People who just do copious amounts of drugs and flunk out of high school at 10th grade, you know. He joined the military shortly after that when he was old enough. And I do know that he was dishonorably discharged for violence. I know that he has a really long rap sheet of violent history, violent crime as a juvenile, and even some as an adult that was kind of like hand washed because it was military. He didn't do a lot of time before these murders, but he did have a long history of violent crime.
Obviously, you've seen the rap sheet and whatnot, but at the end of the day, you're still kind of in the dark about how he was actually raised and the details of it and whatnot.
Right. As far as I know, he was just raised like a standard Christian conservative. That's it. I mean, that's like the extent of what I know.
Are you curious about it? Because, and the reason why I asked too is because, I mean, I've done, not even necessarily just this episode, but other ones too. I've talked to people that have had psychosis, other mental ailments of the like. Oftentimes, there's also a biological, well, of course, you can, as science is now getting us more information about, you can actually inherit these mental illnesses throughout family members because if it runs in your family, there's a chance that you can get them too, or they can be triggered through the use of drugs and whatnot. But not only that, but as science progresses, we're finding that these illnesses can also be found being triggered through certain thought patterns of abuse or different stimuli that you might experience in childhood, or not at all, or they could just randomly develop as far as we know. With that information,
I know where you're going with that.
Yes, and with that information being presented, does that make you curious as to how he was raised? Not to justify his actions, but just to understand.
From what I know, he was not abused. He was definitely not abused because I have a short, sort of very casual relationship with his brother, his sister, and his cousins and some of their family members. I've spoken with them, and they were definitely not abused. If anything, the drug usage is a very high. I know that schizophrenia is a very high risk, especially of triggering with drug use, and he did do a lot of drugs, especially in his teenage years, like in high school and in the military. I know he's very stubborn, and he's stubborn about taking his schizophrenia medication. He doesn't like the effect that it has on his brain. He doesn't like how it makes him docile, I guess. That's one of the reasons why he a lot of times doesn't like taking it, or if he can avoid taking it, he won't take it.
How does your biological father's family feel about his actions also? What have they said about it?
Oh, that's a bad one. So their family still to this day gets shit on Facebook about, and 30 years later still gets shit on Facebook about this horrible thing that happened and that destroyed their little town, and they actually had to move cities because his sister was being bullied in school for it.
So I'm assuming that they're not quite happy with him at all.
No, they're definitely. He's treated like scum. To be frank, I mean, even by his own family, they don't talk to him. They don't talk about him. They erased him from the slate. That's how they want to look at it. His sister does write to him, but she's the only one in his side of the family that writes to him. So as far as I know, his sister and my mom are the only two people that write him.
Do you know the nature of their relationship with your biological father's sister and him?
She has a bit of disdain for him, but also empathy and that's why she writes him. There's a mix of both. It's a weird mix of like contempt and empathy. I wouldn't know how to describe it in words besides that. She does feel bad for him, but at the same time, she's still how it affected her life.
Back to kind of like your perspective, with not only the woman that he murdered, but alongside those two other people, has that family or the families of those who were affected ever reached out to you or said anything to you?
No, they don't know that I exist. It's kind of a because since I was raised by his best friend, I have his last name. I'm on the birth certificate that he's my father. So I don't have the same last name as the man that committed the crimes. Nobody else knows that he's my biological father, aside from my immediate family.
I feel like this conversation is very gray in the sense that the more emotions that you throw into a situation, the harder it becomes to navigate. And I'm not quite sure how I'd feel in your position. I'm sure that anybody else would agree. Do you feel as if you have to apologize on behalf of your father ever to these families?
I do. I have, but they didn't write me anything back.
And so even though they didn't write you back, I would like to say that, I mean, given the nature of the relationships that you've described so far, I would say that even if you didn't, I could see the argument for that. But even though you did, I think that was a good thing, if it means anything. How long ago did you write them?
It was a long time ago. I don't want to say when I was around 21, 22 years old. So maybe a couple years after I found out what happened.
And so, do you know anything about your father's experience in prison so far? Has he ever written about how he's been treated or if he's come around or gotten better?
So, from what I understand, his prison experience has been, there's a very heavy racial aspect to it. He's a tall dude, but he's thin. He doesn't work out, and he's older, obviously now. So there's a racial aspect of him joining one of the white gangs to keep himself safe, is kind of how he put it. He also says that because of the nature of his crime, that the other guys in prison know about it and also are disgusted with him. He said most of the dudes in prison they don't have any empathy for him. They are disgusted with him.
In the future, I do plan on kind of diving into more with prison culture with somebody who's been in it. Say that I'm fairly ignorant as to how it actually works, on account of the fact that I haven't gone into depth with any perspectives on it. But does he was he ever attacked or beaten by other members?
Yes, it sounds like he's been attacked before, and he does get a little bit of extra protection from the guards due to like the nature of him being, I guess, high risk. But he still is amongst the general population of that prison. So he's not solitary.
And he's been in prison for you don't have to give an exact number, but for about how long?
Close to 30 years, I would say.
There comes this question, and it's a very difficult question, and I found myself wondering the same question throughout the duration of our conversation. Do you think he can ever pay, or do you think that he's paid for his crimes?
So, I don't think that, my perspective on it is that paying for crimes, it's not a concept that makes sense to me. It's not like you do a crime and then you pay for it. Is there like a monetary? Is there like amount of time that you would pay? Is there amount of do you lose a limb? Do they cut your hand off? Do they cut? There isn't anything that you could do to pay for it to make it right, to make it equal. So that concept just doesn't float with me. Do I think that he could ever be in another world, reintroduced into society? No. I think his illness is severe enough, his delusions are severe enough, his schizophrenia is severe enough that he needs to be kept away from society. Also, in conjunction with him refusing to actually maintain his medication, it makes him dangerous.
Has he ever shown remorse?
No. Nope.
Does that ever get to you?
Yes. Yeah, it does.
That's quite the gray situation to find yourself in. You mentioned before that he acts a little bit more docile. Can you go into a little bit more depth about that?
There's basically two modes when I'm writing him. He's either on his medication or he's not on his medication. And when he's on his medication, he's a normal person. He's speaking with me, and he's collected and articulate, and like I said, just a normal person. When he's not on his medication, he's incoherent. His thoughts are jumbled. They're very multiple train of thoughts going on at once, and delusional as well sometimes. He sent me one letter one time telling me that he was basically John Connor from Terminator, like describing it this way, like he's John Connor from Terminator, and Nazis are out to get me, and I need to like protect myself. Like a subculture of neo-Nazis have spy cam drones flying around my house, like that kind of delusion. Like I said, there's two different modes when I'm speaking with him. So there's either that, or there's normal dad.
You know, this question is easy for, or I feel like a little bit easier on somebody like me who's been fortunate enough to not, at least as far as I know, have any members in my close family that have committed such a dense act. And this, of course, has influence in how I interpret the following question I'm going to ask you. And I would like your perspective too, as your father was had committed several murders. What's your opinion on the death penalty?
I don't agree with the death penalty. I think an eye for an eye is just kind of pointless. It doesn't fix anything. I do think, like I said, in another parallel universe, my father could have gotten the correct medication, could have gotten the correct treatment earlier in his life, and maybe not murdered. It just, it happened to fall. The chips happened to fall the way that they did.
Going on more so in the present moment, back to kind of how your mom and we can call him your father figure once again, do they ever really bring him up in conversation to you, or is this just kind of like more of a you thing still?
No. So my father figure did pass away when I was around 13. He never mentioned him ever while I was growing up. Never once. My mother either. Never talked about him at all. My mother, now that the cat is out of the bag and I know that he is my biological father, she still does not talk about him. It's taboo topic.
So all of this kind of just weighs in on you, really, for the most part.
Yeah. She's like I said, still, even to this day, even though I've taken a DNA test and I've matched with his relatives, she's still somewhat in denial that he's my biological father. She still doesn't want it to be true.
That's how deep that goes, huh?
Yeah.
But once you had even found out that your father was, once again, had murdered people, did you see yourself differently?
I did, because I was nervous that I could be schizophrenic. I was nervous that because it is a hereditary thing. And I was also, like I said earlier, I was also a very edgy kid. I didn't have a good upbringing, as you could tell, like with the different father figures that are in my life. I was always an edgy kid. I always had a kind of a mean streak to me. And so when I found that out, I was like, could I be schizophrenic? Could I be a murderer?
I just can't really fathom how that must have made you feel. Did you ever at once question yourself and wonder if you could commit such an act too?
I did. I thought, like, could I do something like this? Would I have no remorse? How would I feel if I did something like this? And I thought about that a lot.
That question I had asked earlier. And you know what? I think so far in this conversation too, and I think about at this point it's probably coming to a close too. I think that you've demonstrated that you've navigated this pretty well, given your fucking circumstances. I mean, all of this seems extremely gray, and it seems as though you've come to a point in your life where you have I'm not sure if you ever get a sense of closure with this, but you seem as though you've navigated it to a point where it's manageable. And it seems as though too that you've managed it quite responsibly, I would say, given the nature of the situation. And once again, you know, if your future, if your son in the future, if he comes across this episode and you show it to him, which would be pretty awesome, maybe in like what, he's 15 years from now, you know, if he ever comes across this, wow, that'd be quite the seed that this would plant. If he ever comes across this in this little time capsule of a moment, do you still know what you would say to him?
Yes, I want to. Like I said, prior to him being an adult, I want to tell him. I want to sugarcoat it a little bit. After he's an adult, I do want to give complete honesty. So I want to tell him whatever he wants to ask me. I'm not just going to dump it on him, but I do want to answer anything he asks me honestly. So everything that I know, everything that I've told you, I would tell him.